Welcome one and all, panelists, attendees, and designated eavesdroppers. The panel before us seeks to address the issue of the likely future of humanity. Now, you know you're in trouble when a runaway present slams into an onrushing future with the full force of a thunderclap. That's where we are today. All the forces we have all known about since World War II have been steadily accumulating right before us for decades and are now coming to a crashing head. What are they? Well, the usual: nuclear arms, climate change, and that top of the charts favorite of our species, war. In fact, many perspicacious see World War III as already in motion. So don't wait for the media to announce it. Otherwise, it might go something like this: the world ends tonight at 9, details at 11. Instead, survey its scope in what's about you today: genocide, ethnocide, and ecocide. The hoi polloi have nothing to do with any of these crises. The power elites are in deep in all of them. So, does humanity have a future? I'll give you a couple of seconds to hold your breath. No. We knew that when they split the atom, easily the most fiendish act in the history of humankind, especially when you know why they were anxious to do so. Doom is now only a matter of time, not whether, but when. But that's just my personal reckoning. Perhaps this panel might offset such prognostications and convince us otherwise. Maybe echoing the poet who wrote, "Say not the struggle not availeth," and though our hopes turned out to be dupes, could be that our fears may also turn out to be liars. Maybe, maybe not. The issue is not one of being optimistic or pessimistic. Those are usually just attitudes of the unlettered. We as scholars need always be realists, that is fact-based. Dreams are not for the woke. So who are our panelists then? All distinguished scholars in multiple fields: Professors Fadhel Kaboub, Radhika Desai, Michel Bauwens, Genevieve Vaughan, Ruth Nyambura, and Guy McPherson. The modus operandi: each panelist is posed a two-part query in 2 separate rounds of questioning. Then we'll hold a brief cross-conversation with a view to elucidate and clarify matters. At some point within this melee, I'm just joking, last and always least, I will intrude with my own 2 little red cents. Let me close now with a snatch of verse that I wrote in 2017, but which I think fits this occasion. It's titled Augury. Neither a moon of our delight, nor a prince of darkest night. Is it eclipse or ellipsis? No one can really say. The times they are will all distray. Judgment long has fled away. To protest too is quite outré, for every dog must have its day. The stage is set, the die is cast. No link there be to remembrance past. Main Street torpid drags along. Wall Street turbid admits no wrong. History is over, the game is clear. Soothsayers say the end is near. We may not smile nor shed a tear. Hope all dead, what's left is fear. So woe betide, alack, alas. Dare we hope this too shall pass? Dare we hope this too shall pass? So with those cheerful words, let's start things off. I will request each panelist to just take a couple of seconds off to tell us what you do, since I am not fully apprised, I may not be accurate there prior to speaking. And finally, let me introduce our IT director, Diane, and her friend, Lisa, if they can please show themselves and say hello, who will be keeping a watchful eye on our proceeding. And we thank them for that task. All right, then we're ready to go. So let's start with, let me see, it is Guy.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am going to talk about something that few people talk about. I'm speaking to you from occupied Abenaki territory. That was those were the indigenous people who lived here before we showed up. Okay, then, as every ecologist knows, and apparently very few other people, the rate of environmental change is among the most important factors controlling the continued survival of ecological entities. These ecological entities include, for example, individuals, populations, communities, and species. If the environment occupied by an individual or a species changes, then the individual or the species must change. Evolution by natural selection is typically a relatively slow process, requiring at least one generation and usually many generations to ensure adaptation. For species such as Homo sapiens, our ability to procreate comes at a relatively late age, thereby guaranteeing a minimum of a few decades for adaptation to occur. Adaptation refers to the ability to adjust to current and future negative effects of climate change. Unfortunately, the ongoing and projected rates of environmental change far outstrip the ability of our species to adapt. Indeed, Strone and Bradshaw pointed out in their November 13th, 2018 paper, published in the renowned peer-reviewed journal Scientific Reports, the ongoing rate of environmental change exceeds the ability of any life on Earth to keep up. Their paper was titled "Co-Extinctions Annihilate Planetary Life During Extreme Environmental Change." The extreme environmental change to which the paper refers is 5 to 6 degrees C above the 1750 baseline within a few centuries. Based on the peer-reviewed papers I've been citing for more than a decade, the supporting papers that have been published more recently, I cannot imagine it will take centuries to achieve an additional 5 or 6 degrees of planetary heating. In addition, because the ongoing and projected rates of environmental change are so severe, I cannot imagine we have centuries or even decades with habitat for humans. If by centuries you mean hours or days, then we have plenty of time remaining. However, the time for adaptation is long behind us. As a result of anthropogenic climate change, Earth is experiencing the most rapid change in planetary history. This change is irreversible. This abrupt, irreversible change was published in 2 reports produced more than 5 years ago by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an organization designed to fail when it was created during the Ronald Reagan administration. Michael Oppenheimer, a professor at Princeton University, concluded that the IPCC was designed to fail in his essay on the November 1st, 2007 post at the Environmental Defense Fund website. Specifically, Oppenheimer wrote in an essay titled "How the IPCC Got Started" that the scientists were discouraged from being activists and were instead taking a passive approach in their lives and their work. 2 reports published by the IPCC, again which was designed to fail, concluded that anthropogenic climate change is abrupt and irreversible. Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, published October 8, 2018, concluded global warming is the most rapid in planetary history. If you're keeping score, that was more than 6 years ago. In this report, the IPCC includes this line, quote, "These global level rates of human-driven change far exceed the rates of change driven by geophysical or biosphere forces that have altered the Earth system trajectory in the past. Even abrupt geophysical events do not approach current rates of human-driven change," end quote. The IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, published September 24, 2019, concluded an overheated global ocean is responsible for the irreversibility of climate change. More than 5 years ago, the IPCC included this language in its report, quote, "Ocean acidification and deoxygenation, ice sheet and glacier mass loss, and permafrost degradation are expected to be irreversible on timescales relevant to human societies and ecosystems. This IPCC special report concluded an overheated ocean is responsible for the irreversibility of climate change." Unfortunately, recent research indicates anthropogenic climate change is not slowing down. Rather, it is accelerating. The situation worsens every day, as pointed out in peer-reviewed papers. There is at least one means by which we can hasten our demise and therefore the extinction of all life on Earth. We can reduce or stop industrial civilization. At the same time industrial activity produces the greenhouse gases that trap heat, industrialization also produces tiny particles that block and therefore prevent incoming radiation. According to renowned climate scientist James E. Hansen during interviews, presentations, and peer-reviewed papers, these aerosols fall out of the atmosphere in about 5 days. In so doing, they no longer block incoming radiation. The result is a stunningly rapid increase in planetary heating. This phenomenon has been still illustrated many times during the past few years, perhaps most notably as a result of decreased pollution from ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. And now I invite Radhika to join us.
Thank you, Rajani, and thanks for all the panelists and everybody in the audience. Yeah, so what is the future that I see in front of us? Obviously, within the parameters that Guy McPherson just laid out, which is really not my specialty, but I do pay attention to it. That is, there is definitely a very strong sense in which climate change is worsening, and over the past half decade or so since COVID, people really haven't been paying much attention to this very serious problem. To me, I would say that in the immediate future, I see things worsening. But when I say things worsening, I mean the chaos in which most societies, particularly Western societies, find themselves. I see climate change worsening. I see the possibility of nuclear war getting closer. And so on. And I think at the core of all this, I consider to be capitalism, and in particular neoliberal capitalism, which is the only kind we have. And that includes, by the way, climate change. I'll be glad if if Guy corrects me, but in my limited knowledge, if you look at every index of climate change or biodiversity, every index of ecological devastation, whether it is climate, global warming, biodiversity loss, pollution, etc., yes, the indices were rising over many decades. But then once you get to 1980, they rise up even faster. So there's no doubt that the onset of neoliberalism, the increasing inequality of the world, the increasing freedom of some people to squander resources and other people, and the reduction of other people to the status of having to scramble for what little they have, I think this is a worsening climate change. I've also written an essay about the deep and close link between nuclear weapons and capitalism as a system, capitalism which necessarily needs imperialism and therefore was so committed to developing nuclear weapons, etc. So I think, anyway, so to me, as long as neoliberalism is not abandoned, particularly by the major capitalist societies of the world, we are going nowhere good. The militarism war, etc., that the accelerated militarism war, etc., that we are witnessing is basically occasioned by the West's refusal to accept its own relative decline, particularly vis-a-vis China. And of course, its desire to dominate the rest of the world. And, to the extent that, for example, recently, the United States was willing to, or the United States actions have essentially given at least one other country a good reason to believe that it has no option but to itself develop nuclear weapons. As you know, I'm talking about Iran. So essentially what we are going to look at in the immediate future is the continued decline of the West, which, by the way, I attribute to the same neoliberalism. I define neoliberalism as a policy paradigm which has essentially a one-point program to give big corporate capital as much freedom as it likes, no matter what the consequences, even for small capital, let alone working people, and so on. And I think that this is itself leading to the enervation of Western economies, the lack of growth, the lack of productive investment, financialization, military adventurism, etc. So there will be a further multiplication of the contradictions of these Western societies. Economic decline will be compounded by social division, political logjam, cultural degeneration of every sort, and of course the West in its in the throes of these contradictions will of course externalize this as conflict vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And of course, in the rest of the world as well, still far too many countries remain wedded to some version of neoliberalism, and that's going to be a problem. And of course, significant parts of the world, led particularly by China, Russia, but also including countries like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Yemen, other socialist countries, the
30
countries of the
seconds left.
Sahel increasingly. All of these anti-system forces will, of course, continue to strengthen, which will simply result in the West, throwing the West into further paroxysms of militarism and so on. But in the long run, I believe there is hope. I believe capitalism is definitely declining. More and more of the world is becoming disabused of the idea that somehow it is this magical Schumpeterian growth engine. The success of socialist China in developing a very large economy and doing so very convincingly in a practically historically unprecedented manner is already changing public consciousness around the world. Militarily, oddly enough, the West is on the back foot. You didn't get the ceasefire in Iran because the West succeeded. You got it because the West realized that it had squandered.
That's time.
Yeah. Thank you, Radhika. Sorry that we had to cut you off there. I call now upon Michel to continue.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Rajani. Thank you, Diane. And thank you to the previous speakers. Just because you asked a little presentation. So I'm Michel Bauwens. I live in Chiang Mai, Northern Thailand, and I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation. I think that's enough. In some way, I think I will react to a few of the things that have been said. So there is a study called the HANDY report, Human and Nature Dynamics. And what it shows is basically that since the late Neolithic, every human society has collapsed. So why am I saying this? Because it shows that it's not just a problem of capitalism. Of course, capitalism is global, and it has led to serial exhaustion of the world and to a rapid deterioration in climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So that's certainly true. But simply reverting to the older models, I think is not going to be enough. So in a paradoxical way, it's a problem of civilization itself. And that's a paradox. So civilization, in a way, could be interpreted as a decision by certain human groups in Mesopotamia to master nature in order to overcome some local climate change. And it is based on a mastery of nature. And it has worked for a while, problematically, but it has worked in creating, let's say, longer lifestyles and all of these things. But I think we've reached a limit to this kind of mastery narrative. And so the idea then is, how do we get back to a more partnership-based relation? And this, of course, creates another problem, which is that we can't simply go back. So indigenous people who have lived for much longer times in equilibrium, up to 50,000, 100,000 years in Australia, supported a much, much smaller human population. And we have, I think, 400 nuclear plants that need to be kept for 10,000 years because we can't deal with the waste products. So I think we are facing a physical crisis. So that was really, already at the end, I guess. But I think I also want to say a word about the spiritual crisis. And this is where, if we talk about the certainty of a collapse, we have to take into account that it is saying to young people that you cannot project yourself in the future. And this is why I like Radhika's point that we have to, keep an opening to the solutions. And I know that's the second part, so I'll do my part about the solutions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. And now I'll call upon Ruth to join us. Would you please say a few words about yourselves? That's necessary, since I did not introduce you. Thank you. Go ahead, Ruth.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers before me. My name is Ruth Nyambura. I'm a feminist political ecologist based in Nairobi, Kenya, and Cape Town, South Africa. I work on the intersections of gender economy and ecological justice. And at this point, I am joining you from Maputo, Mozambique. And so just to get into the question, so first of all, thank you very much to the speakers before me who've laid out a really fantastic foundation. And I will try to focus on the continent of Africa, which is my political organizing space. So we're witnessing a convergence of multiple and intersecting crises in the form of a renewed crisis of imperialism and neocolonialism. And I think it is important to center how imperialism, its form, content, and character at this particular moment is contributing to the co-constructions of this multiple and intersecting crisis. So this conjunctural crisis that is surfacing fundamental issues, the longue durée of the global climate and biodiversity crisis, hunger and food insecurity continue to grow at shocking levels, de-development and the historical curtailing of industrialization and manufacturing, and of course on the continent of Africa, but the wider global south, the shocking levels of energy poverty, even as we continue to witness the growth of extractive industries, ecocide, and the continued plundering of resources across the continent of Africa, the wider global south majority, and importantly, the exploitation of labor in very gendered ways, for example. So at the same time, we're also witnessing the resurgence of right-wing fundamentalist politics and fascism, the rolling back of hard-fought for rights around women's bodily autonomy and the fullness of our being, as well as the small space of rights that have been carved out for gender and sexual minorities, not just on the continent of Africa, but we witness the global backlash. So in addition to these grim realities for the present, but of course into the future, if we do not change course, we're witnessing the rapid militarization, which has become a terrifying reality for many of us across the world. We are seeing that Europe, for example, is increasing its war budgets, but that's not just in Europe or North America. We're also witnessing it across the continent of Africa, with governments increasingly spending more on policing and the military than on the provision of social and public services. Proxy armed conflicts continue to intensify, for example, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, in the north of Africa, from war crimes and genocide in Sudan, South Sudan, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as the expansion and deepening of highly repressive states from Kenya, which is my own country, Tanzania, Mozambique, where I am at this particular moment for a movement meeting. So this is now becoming, the rapid militarization is now becoming a common and bridging theme across the whole continent, but the wider world. And finally, we are also witnessing firsthand both the constant reinvention of the structural modalities that aid the capitalist exploitation, as Fanon called it, the wretched of the earth, across Africa and across the world, with even more expansive and intensive forms of privatization of the public sector, as well as the commons in the form of austerity 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, being pushed by the usual suspects like the IMF and the World Bank, and more so since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Yet, with these grim realities, we need to hold something very centrally. Yet these crises are not going unchallenged across the continent of Africa specifically, as can be witnessed by the Popular People's Revolt led by the youth in Kenya in June 2024 and June 2025 against the ruling elite, and importantly, the imperialist architecture of what was then in Kenya, for example, a finance bill that was literally carved out for us by the IMF institution. In Mozambique last year, we also witnessed a rebellion against the blatant illegalities of the general elections in October of 2025. And just like in Kenya, it came at an excruciatingly high cost in the number of lives lost, people jailed, and lives destroyed by the state repression that ensued. So at the same time, even with these grim realities, there seems to be a reawakened critique, an attempt to grapple with and break free from history. of colonialism and imperialism, as well as to chart new paths for development, regionalism, and liberation, which is exciting, of course, across the continent of Africa and across the globe, even with the grim realities. Liberation, resistance, and ideas around a new world is possible, as Arundhati Roy says, still remains within our realities, our presence, and into the futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And now I'll ask Fadhel, once again, please say a few words about yourself before you start.
Thank you very much, Rajani, for hosting this conversation, and it's an honor to be with all of you on this panel. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I'm an economist originally from Tunisia. I teach economics at Denison University in Ohio, and today I'm speaking to you from Dakar in Senegal. I wanted to, with sincerest apologies to Rajani for being an economist for the next few minutes, I will say a few words to build a little bit on what Ruth was just laying out for us in terms of the specific issues on the African continent, but broadly speaking, the global South. For the first question that we're addressing today, it's very important to understand where we're coming from so that when we talk about solutions, we understand what needs to be undone and what needs to be transformed. And it's not going to be not trying to lecture the audience here or the esteemed panelists about what colonialism has done to the African continent. But it's very important to specify three important economic functions that were imposed on Africa. And those economic functions persist to this day. I'll summarize them very quickly. Number one, Africa was supposed to be the place that provides cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. Number two, Africa was supposed to be the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, partnership. But effectively what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that function to this day. And of course, colonial economic functions were not designed for democracy, for justice, for development, for human rights. Colonialism was extractive, abusive, hierarchical, violent, right? So why are we surprised today that the same economic structures that persist, why are we surprised that it's supposed to produce the Sustainable Development Goals or to produce justice or protect human rights? By design, those noble goals are not achievable under the current global economic architecture. And when I say global economic architecture, to be very specific about what needs to be undone, we're talking about four basic pillars that were built during colonial times and the period after independence. That is the financial architecture, that's the World Bank and the IMF, both created during colonial times for colonial purposes. The rules of trade and investment architecture, that's the World Trade Organization, and the rules of international taxation, which for the longest time were in the hands of the OECD countries until a year and a half ago, thanks to the Africa Group and the rest of the G77, we finally have a process now in the UN of literally decolonizing international taxation. And that process is unfolding and is very viciously resisted by the OECD countries, by the global north. So unless we undo that global economic architecture that was not designed by us, not designed for us, we are not going to see any progress on any of the goals that we're talking about, whether it's on the climate front, on the development front, and so on. And that architecture created a colonial economic and geopolitical hierarchy that is not meant to be disrupted. So every time in these multilateral spaces where they were negotiating debt or development in the Financing for the Development Conference or climate change and the COP conferences, every time we bring up the transformation, the structural decolonization of these economic functions, of these key institutions, of this architecture, that's where you see the red lines being exposed. by the global north, where they say, no, 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 we are not going to allow this to happen, essentially. And that is what needs to be done. So before we move to the second part of the discussion to talk about the transformation of this new multipolar world that we want to see born, no multipolar world can be born without Africa and the rest of the global south being repositioned as the global majority at the center of a new international economic order. So I'll leave it at that, and then we'll move on to the next section. Thank you again for hosting this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Fadhel. And now I call upon Jen to continue. And again, please say a few words about yourself before you start.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for your very interesting discussion. I'm an American who lives in Rome part of the time, and I have been working on one idea for many, many years about a maternal gift economy that would be a different way of looking at the world based on the nurturing of children. And I'll be talking about that here, and so that's what I do. So contrary to what Darwin thought, the evolution of human beings does not depend on the principle of the survival of the fittest, but on the survival of the unfittest, because human babies are born completely unfit and dependent for the first years, so they have to be nurtured unilaterally by others, and if they survive, they all depend on and receive the model of a unilateral gifting, need-satisfying economy performed by their motherers. I believe that this early model persists throughout life at many levels because that is contradicted by quid pro quo exchange and hidden and exploited by the capitalist market, which takes unilateral gifts of surplus value to amass power and profit and to exercise control over people and processes. There is a basic web of human life that is made by satisfying others' needs through the maternal gift economy, and it is what is being destroyed, torn to shreds now by the wars and environmental devastation. The focus of attention now in 2025 on the oligarchy, on those capitalists who have been nurtured and nurtured themselves most on the maternal gift economy, having succeeded in capturing the gifts of many, and who therefore have the money, power to buy votes and loyalties. This is particularly evident and deadly in the coalition of oligarchs who have continued to fund and implement the mayhem of Zionism against Palestine, which has now morphed into a campaign of starvation, destroying the means of giving for the population. So the maternal gift economy in Gaza is deeply depleted, and the web of life is in shreds. All this is accomplished with a display of terminal sadism by healthy Israeli soldiers who shoot the desperately hungry while the world helplessly watches. Babies with limbs like sticks and cavernous eyes stare at skeletal mothers who, despite their breaking hearts, have nothing to give. Patriarchal capitalism, incarnated in its governments, militaries, business people, and allies, is taking everything, ignoring needs that are not made real and effective by money. So the gift economy is made helpless, and the web of life of the gift is torn, and population falls through to its annihilation. In this case, leaving room for a high-dollar resort strip to be built on the beloved martyred land. The disaster in Palestine is the preview of coming events, as the ego-oriented values of the market economy motivate patriarchy and capitalism to ever greater excesses of domination, subjugation, in a world where scarcity is increasing and where polluted Mother Earth can no longer provide abundantly for all. If the Nazi Holocaust is the ancestor responsible for this ferocity of this generation of Israelis against Palestinians, what will be the effect of on the Palestinians of the future and on future generations of those of us who have let the genocide happen. The web of life is being destroyed, and we watch it happening in horror from the safety of our well-stocked kitchens. But down the road, will our children also become victims, or will they become perpetrators? The war of Israel on Gaza shows that the validation of genocide is transmissible, an intergenerational disease, and that a license to kill can be provided by powerful and complicit allies. I believe there is probably also a conscious or unconscious Malthusian fear in the hearts of the powerful of the present that with the depletion of Earth's resources due to environmental devastation, the global population will soon exceed the food supply and a general struggle for survival will ensue. The ability of one man like Trump to make nightmares real is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it is a defect of democracy due to its merger with oligarchy. If things remain as they are, we run the risk of these nightmares and their perpetrators multiplying as many clones of Trump and Netanyahu come to power.
Thank you, Jen. You're such a fantastic panel that I sort of wonder what I'm doing on it. I lied. I said I'll contribute my 2 little red cents. Now it's going to be a lot more than that, at least worth a wooden nickel, I think. But more seriously, I worked on these ideas that I'm about to present for the last 35 years on my own, away from the academy. And it's a critique of Eurocentrism at large. So I'll begin without any further ado. And I'll go a little bit faster than usual in order to keep to the same time as all of you. I'm just combining the 5 and 10 that you have into one 15-minute slot. So I'll be answering the same 2 queries, but from within a foundational analysis that questions all of received social theory. For some 2 centuries, most of the world has toiled under the spell of European ideas and institutions. It is a sea we swim and drown in. I have titled that corpus of received thinking Euro-modernism, EM for short, the genre of modernism that Europe imposed first on itself and then on the worlds it conquered. I have sought in my work to redress that imbalance, and what follows in desperate brevity is a transcendent critique, accent on the adjective, transcendent critique of Eurocentric paradigms. It is a verifiable and realist amendment and supplement to all of modernist societal speculations. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains, gushed Rousseau somewhere in 1762, which is emblematically a Eurocentric, Euro-modernist, crypto-Judeo-Christian Enlightenment trope with absolutely no ontic foundation. No, humans are not born free to be or become this or that as they please. That is the feint that has bedeviled the Euro-modernist world ever since. It is the basis for all the historical traumas of EM societies, imagining they could be anything they wish to be except what they actually are. Note the paradox. The promise of some or other fanciful utopia dangled as the eternal carrot, obscuring the contra-reality of a grim, stark, oppressive wasteland. Note also that the entire panoply of EM strictures was never voted in by majority vote or popular acclaim, but imposed perforce, first in Europe and then globally. Stripped of its modernist veils, societal life becomes limpidly transparent. So who are we? We are hominids, close cousins to chimps, sharing 99% of our genes with them. And we cannot be nor do a whole lot better or worse than that. Let me sketch matters in a laundry list fashion. We are like so many mammals, pack and herd animals. We are best equipped to function in families, clans, and tribes, which are surrogates for the above. In Gemeinschaft, not Gesellschaft grouping, i.e. small face-to-face personal settings rather than the impersonal large-scale units that we are accustomed to. In fact, we are naturally, and I'll use that term advisedly throughout, tribalist in all our doings. We belong, again, naturally, not to a political economy of interests, which is the banal modernist conceit, but to a rich, moral community of primal affections. This is critical because EM agendas, left or right, evolved under the governing geist of materialism, which was back then the best physics of its time. Not anymore. Aside from its being bad morals, bad theology, and bad philosophy, materialism is also bad science, if one is acquainted even marginally with quantum physics. Matter is no longer prima materia. It was replaced by its dual energy under relativism, and both got subsumed within the notion of the field in quantum field theory. At any rate, our highest need as mammals may not be to build billionaire fortunes, or cathedrals, or compose violin concertos, or fabricate fanciful Arcadias, but far more mundanely and simply what we observe sea lions doing, to huddle. We are heat seekers, not light seekers. The foundational urges of human society are biological, cultural, and moral, not materialist. A human society is inexorably a moral amalgam, an idea totally alien to Euro-modernist reductionism. Human values are qualitative, not quantitative. Little wonder that we rot and decay in this age of quantity, gloriously initiated and glorified by Euro-modernists. Once severed and uprooted from the healing ethos of our social matrix, we fall prey to the pangs of angst, alienation, and anomie, and morph in due time into the now ubiquitous run of sociopaths and psychopaths. That is what European modernism has achieved. And that is why we find ourselves where we are today, adrift far, far from our vital affective moorings. And we will face total societal atrophy in a Hobbesian bellum omnium contra omnes scenario if we persist on this path. The more advanced a society is along this EM trajectory, the more it will exhibit such traits, which explains the US today quite succinctly. Indeed, I've termed it the world's first amoral society, which is a true contradiction in terms, where increasingly anything goes in a fitful state of post-human, post-truth, post-moral derangement. To continue, behaviorally speaking, human males appear to take after chimps, females after bonobos. The former possessed of instinctual violence, yen for domination, the latter instinctual nurturance. Yes, all sentient life on this planet is instinctually governed, and we are no exception. Instincts in EM ideology are deemed to be irrelevant to humans, though necessary to understand animal behavior. Levi-Strauss once said, instincts explain nothing. Why this strange dualism? Why this split? Possibly, in fact, obviously, because of the latent Judeo-Christian notion that we, unlike mere animals, are cast in the image of God, unless you happen to be non-Europeans, whence you were called literally natur folk, translate primitive, more accurately, savage people. Darwin's monumental correction, which I see as the crown jewel of European science, came far too late and was protested vehemently even to this day. Now, civilization begins when two baseline conditions are satisfied. One, when the natural world is tamed, domesticated, pacified, which men and women both collaborate in. And two, when the societal world is similarly stabilized, that is, men and male violence are tamed, domesticated, and pacified by women, so children can be reared safely, safe, that is, away from male predations. As progenitors and initial food providers, it is women who are thereby, of necessity, the first and original peacekeepers. They do this by enchaining the aggressive impulses of males in emotive coils of domesticity, which makes both for intra-tribal safety and also creates a vital cordon sanitaire for raising the otherwise highly vulnerable human infant. By the way, no other stratagem has ever worked any better. Yet in the long run, given their quote-unquote animal spirits, males break away from the restraints of simple tribal society and go on in time to found empires that we know all too well. So basically, war is the near permanent condition of our species. In a fit of rash modesty, I term it Kanth's law. But think about that. War is our permanent condition. So let us not affect surprise when we see it happening all around us, as we have throughout history. Much gets clarified in this perspective. For example, what we understand in modern parlance, or modernist parlance, as racism, is oft leastways at base a tribal reaction to the other, varying in scope and intensity depending on circumstances. However, European racism has a slightly deeper, darker provenance. It stems not least from the perhaps not entirely irrational fear that so-called miscegenation, don't they come up with wonderful words? This used to be quite common until recently, that is, racial intermarriage, would make some unique traits of Europeans, blonde hair, blue eyes, for example, vanish from the face of the earth along with them. So we may need to re-examine all EM notions of race, gender, state, nation, individualism, democracy, etc., as I'm doing and as I've done. In fact, the entire loaded vocabulary of EM may have to be reviewed as misguided and misleading. To press on. Once freed of tribal restraints, our natural tendency is oligarchy, towards which all political systems gravitate regardless of what they think they are. And state and nation, those two concepts conjoined as the nation state, key EM innovations was consecrated roughly in 1648 at the Treaty of Westphalia, correspond to no requisite need of the human race, but are imposed artifacts by governing elites to affirm and consolidate power. Besides, EM structures are willfully organized adversarially, be it in the legal or political arena, requiring us to be disaffected and distrustful of one another at all times. The asocial individual, that's the real AI we should worry about, stripped of all culture, community ties, is another unique EM construction and a pretty feckless creature. By the way, the non-European world has never been able to wholly entertain, accept, or even sacralize such a freakish character. Groveling in desperate loneliness, and yet Jean-Paul Sartre, sipping his espresso on the Rue Gauche, could still moan that hell is other people, craving community and connection, but losing herself in surrogate, sordid satisfactions that only take her down the primrose path of accumulating an irreparable misery and aphasia. No wonder that the UK recently created a minister for loneliness. What a striking admission of an utterly failed society. So EM turns a band of wannabe convivials into a sullen company of strangers. You don't know what that means, sullen company of strangers? Take a ride on the New York City subway. Equally untenable are the facile utopias, be it so-called communism or its antipode, the so-called free society. They will and have all failed and floundered, more or less empirically, on the reef of inescapable male power struggles. For there is an iron law of oligarchy that prevails in the domain of power that is simply ineluctable. To sum up, we are animals. Forget the self-dignifying Homo sapiens sapiens hype. And we inhabit a societal jungle. And nature, and like nature herself, are glaringly red in tooth and claw. No, biology is not destiny. That is not what I'm saying. But neither can it be dismissed as irrelevant. At times, freedom is only imaginable with the prior recognition of necessity. If we are beset perennially by war and violence, and tell me when we have not, it is because human males are programmed for these traits. That is why, as people have observed throughout the ages, nothing really changes. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And note that life is as dangerous today in 21st century United States, where the populace is inured from harm, not by the curated civilities of custom, culture, and convention, but much more mundanely by Smith and Wesson, more or less as Europe itself was in medieval times. Besides, wherever abound more guns than citizenry is not a civilization, but a brutish morass of imminent tension and imminent terror, as the impuissant well know. So much for the EM myth of progress. Yet there's always been a real and realized alternative to these fractious modernist templates. It is that old, pre-existing other way, the perennial salve that simple tribal societies cemented when our species began its long odyssey eons ago. And what is that? Living swathed in mutual affections amongst kith and kin, be that kinship real or ersatz. Social life, like all life on the planet, is spontaneously engendered. It requires no direction, no organization. Yet all the elaborate social engineering that EM policy manifests are redolent with, be they of left or right, demand harsh compulsion. Why? Because they have to force us to go against the grain of who we are. Now, John Stuart Mill is considered to be a patron saint of liberty, and yet he's the one who wrote, "It is all right to force people to be free." Think about that. It's all right to force people to be free. Maybe George Bush was thinking of that when he took us into Iraq. So whence the compulsion to school us away from being naturally cooperative convivials into the mold of what? Canny, calculating, self-seeking, acquisitive automaton. And that is the species that populate the bizarro world of microeconomics. By the way, economics is not a science, but a pathetically obvious see-through EM policy instruction manual. Economics, as I've said elsewhere, is a self-referential language game with zero representational efficacy. So we are taught in modernism to shun one another. Why? Lest we might any time, if left to ourselves, build genuine human communities. What are they? I'll say it again. Face-to-face, organic commonwealths of micro-relations in small village-like communal settings. The Australian Aboriginals are just one amongst many such glittering examples. That is our natural, affective, communitarian habitat beyond the materialist quagmires of capitalism and socialism, which dispenses with the entire top-down corruptions of nations, states, and multinational enterprises that dog our lives, and could return us to a latter-day variation of our original tribal template, embodying its essential traits. By the way, this requires no tutoring, no political agitation, no force, just a welcome relapse into a spontaneous rediscovery once we see through the sham. Then and only then we stand a chance of survival. Nonetheless, we must not idealize this tribalist state of affairs I refer to. It is no utopia. In fact, that word itself is a modernist canard. Recall again, we are sprung from primal ooze. What scope is there for idyllic daydreams of any kind? But rather that the ethos of tribal amity is our original natural state of being, where we have reasonably adjusted to our environs, given our instinctual drives, posing little or no threat to nature or to others. Failing that, we are destined to go the way of the dodo and the dinosaur. But why should we complain, even if we were? 99% of all species that have ever lived have gone extinct. What is so darn special about us? As Carl Sagan said it, extinction is the rule, survival is the exception on this planet. And as I say it, we're here not to linger, but to leave, individually and collectively. In closing, let me highlight, and this is important, the striking difference between real natural institutions and artificial make-believe imposed ones. And I'm reminded of this because of my late friend Roy Bhaskar. One of the important things he said was that people understand things less by analysis, but by contrast, perhaps because of the way our binary logic systems work. Take the human family. It is a natural institution and obeys not one single Euro-modernist stipulation. It is neither free, nor individualist, nor egalitarian, nor democratic. But, and it's a great big but, it gives humans that vital, effective sanctuary for which there is no modernist substitute, none. Compare it to this EM artifact called, quote unquote, a nation. You have to pay or propagandize people to sacrifice for a nation. You don't have to brainwash a mother to save a child falling into harm's way. That's the difference between real and natural institutions and artificial imposed structures. I will hope that this is educational. And I also hope that we can now begin to glean how we have all been living factitious, synthetic, unrequited lives, decoyed far away from the felt needs of our own innate species being. Thank you. And now we can move to round 2 of our plan here, which I believe will start with Radhika.
Okay, so in round 2, we're supposed to answer a different question. The question is what we believe can be done to assure a more provident future. By provident, I suppose I understand one in which we all have basically what we need. So I would say, let me begin by reiterating something that we worked on last year when I was working with Jill Stein on her candidacy for the US election. And we came up with the slogan, people, planet, and peace. And I would say that those are the 3 essential components with, and you would understand, I mean, so first of all, you have to come up with a program that secures these three. By people, we mean everything related to the human individual, human societies, and there is nothing more important than creating greater equality, particularly at a time when we are living in, not only do we live in an era of obscene inequality, but we also see, you know, when not only militarism, but the obscenity of the Epstein affair and other such things come out, that when you have such high levels of inequality, you have people behaving, you know, with impunity and doing the most dastardly things. It's not just, you know, so it's not just war and so on, but also these sorts of things. And the more power you give some people over others, the possibility that it will be abused is greater. By the way, I should say that while Rajani, you said so many very sensible things, I think there's a fundamental paradox to what you say, because if, as you say, we are ruled by instinct, then there's no way that we can improve everything. Everything is destined to be the way it is, and we really can't escape it. So, but anyway, so I think that we have
no, that is not what I said. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Carry on.
All right. So we have to create a more equal society, materially equal in terms of culturally equal, etc. We have to create a more democratic society, a society in which there is also not discrimination on another, other range of counts, whether it is gender, race, etc. And of course, very importantly, going along with what Fadhel and Ruth particularly were saying, ending imperialism, which today is the most fundamental cause of inequality on the planet. So that will be the people element. The planet element, obviously, everything has to be done to reverse the ecological emergency that we are in, consisting, as I understand it, of planetary warming, of loss of biodiversity, and of pollution. And obviously, while I understand the point of view that Guy and others are bringing to this, of accelerating uncontrolled climate change, at the same time, if we have to start somewhere, then we have to start by trying to stall and reverse it, provided there is this is possible, unless, of course, again, we go back to what Rajani was saying, and that is that perhaps if extinction is the rule and survival the exception, then maybe our time for extinction is near. And finally, as far as peace is concerned, it's not just a question of ending militarism. While, of course, it's very important to end militarism, it's also important to remember that while there is such a thing as military-industrial complex, that the fact that some people and some interests around the world make money by making other people go to war, that is not the only reason for going to war. The principal reason for going to war is imperialism, and I think that we have to put a stop to that. So, and that requires putting a stop to capitalism. So here I'll also say that, in contrast to some other speakers who, mentioned that the problem lies with civilization, etc., I would say that undoubtedly there have been problems with other civilizations, but there is something very specific to capitalism which has brought humanity at such an accelerated pace to disaster within the space of 2 or 3 centuries, really, whereas under other civilizations, human beings have existed for very long periods of time. So in order to achieve, so to me, I would make a plea for keeping capitalism as central. And there again, while of course one should criticize what we may call vulgar materialism, the idea that, we should all be motivated by money and so on, materialism as a way, historical materialism as a way of understanding how society works, how did we get to where we are, etc., is indispensable. And that's essentially a broadly Marxist understanding. The second thing I want to say vis-a-vis this, in terms of what we need to do is, for the last many decades, I would say that there has been a very peculiarly individualist bias in left-wing thinking, which shuns two things that I consider very important to reconstructing society on a more rational basis, on a more just basis, on a more environmental basis, etc. And those two things are, number one, you have to have some kind of planning, some kind of society-wide planning. No matter how democratic you make it, there has to be some kind of centralized planning. Otherwise, you will not be able to address the problems, and you will not be able also to take on the powerfully organized interests that are lined up against the future that we would like to work towards. And the second thing is that in order to achieve this, you need to have, again, some kind of instrument of popular control over political authorities. And to my mind, that can only be some or the other version of a political party. Again, no matter how democratic you make it, but at some level, there has to be a society-wide coherent force that is able to plan. And then finally, I think that this is already happening to a considerable extent, but I think that one thing we really have to insist on is that there is, for hundreds of years, at least since the Enlightenment, so much of Western social science has been geared towards arguing that that modern society, we may call it capitalist society, Rajani used the word Gesellschaft, civil society, whatever you want to call it, this modern society is somehow the most natural, and the tendency has been to portray previously existing society, feudal society in particular, but as essentially unnatural. But in fact, the reality is the opposite. Capitalism is the most unnatural way of organizing human society, human social production. And I think the sooner we realize it, then the better it will be for planning our way forward. There was some mention that, we can't be prisoners of old models, by which I presume was meant, say, socialism as an old model. I'm not sure that you can say China today is, in some sense, an old model socialism. And I'm not even necessarily saying that that's the only way to go. But what I am saying is that once you reject the capitalist way of organizing things, once you reject the idée fixe that free markets is the most logical way of organizing our society, then there will be the possibility of for every society to organize itself as consciously, as in a collective, democratic, consciously organized manner, in the way that its own resources, material resources, cultural resources, its own history, and the desires of its own people wish. And I think that that's, to me, the most central thing. So with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. And let me apologize to you profoundly. I stepped out of bounds as an interlocutor to interrupt you, and it will not happen again.
Not at all.
And I appreciate the grace with which you accepted it. You should have protested. But anyway, I'm sorry. So now we move on to Fadhel. The same question. How can we make things better?
Thank you, Rajani. I'll pick up where I left off with my initial comments about creating this new multipolar system in which Africa and the rest of the global South is now positioned as a global majority at the center of a new international economic order of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And it will be, a 10-minute sketch of a much broader and complex explanation. So forgive the brevity of this description, which is a subject of a small booklet that I'm in the process of finishing up now, called The Geopolitical Bargain of the Century, to reposition the global South in a new system. And the idea here is the following: how do you escape the bottom of that hierarchy, the bottom of the global value chain, those colonial traps? How do you undo the global economic architecture that makes it impossible to escape that position? And there's a lot of effort in the global South to reform the World Bank, to reform the IMF, to reform the WTO, to reform, and the system is not reformable. The veto power, the hierarchy, the red lines are not there as a joke. They're there as a serious lock-in. So the idea here is to force the creation of a new economic architecture built from scratch by the Global South, for humanity, as a matter of fact. And the idea here is the following: to use the current geopolitical moment, the window of opportunity, in a way that allows the global majority to create the economic and geopolitical leverage that will compel the global minority to accept a new arrangement. So think, for example, this intense competition between the US and China primarily, and Europe to some extent, Russia to a lesser extent, over access to critical minerals and strategic minerals and markets. Remember, the Global South is the largest market on the planet. It's the richest territory on the planet in terms of resources, in terms of critical minerals. It's the territory that has the largest energy potential, renewable energy potential on the planet. So there's intense competition. So I'll skip to the end of the story. Imagine for a moment, and there's a big assumption here, that we have a block of Global South countries. It doesn't have to be all at once, but political leaders in the Global South who have the courage to think and act differently. And that's our homework, is to build that coalition. Imagine we have a group of 20, 25 countries, for example, who actually agree to work as a bloc on joint industrial policies, on terms that don't reproduce the current global value chain, the current mode of extractivism and violation of labor rights, and on terms that we predefine, which may include certain territories as untouchable, unminable, right, for biodiversity reasons and so on. So this is our homework, is to predefine the terms of a new form of development, of sustainable prosperity. Imagine for a moment we have that high-level political agreement and commitment. We have the youngest labor force on the planet. We have all the strategic minerals and resources needed to deliver the best quality of life that is not driven by consumerism and planned obsolescence and all the things that capitalism has created for us, to have truly a world of sustainable prosperity. And what we have is economies of scale as the largest market on the planet, which is what you need for manufacturing, right? So that you can reduce the cost per unit, so you can, get the gains from innovation and technological development. What is often lacking in the Global South is access to the manufacturing technology. And here we're not talking about all technologies, we're talking about life-saving technologies to manufacture the renewable energy infrastructure, the clean cooking infrastructure, the clean public transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity. This technology is available in the global north and is being intentionally withheld from access to the global south. The leverage that we have here is that this technology is currently available in China, and China is willing to share this technology. But the idea here is not to position China at the top of the geopolitical hierarchy and economic hierarchy. The idea here is to say, here's the deal. This block of countries goes to China and says, look, we offer you the bargain of the century, which is the following. If you agree to share this technology as in joint venture, we don't want loans, in-kind contribution to manufacture and deploy at scale the building blocks of development and prosperity on our terms that we predefine, with pre-negotiated distribution of the value chain, distribution of the income share between workers, pre-negotiated ownership structure. All of that is our homework to co-design. Imagine this is the offer. In return, here's what you get. In 10 to 15 years, you double your economic footprint globally. You double your geopolitical footprint globally. And you secure privileged access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, once we create an alternative model of development and prosperity in the Global South, on Global South terms, every other country in the Global South will have every incentive to join this economic bloc. So we give you privileged access to the largest market on the planet with rising purchasing power. I guarantee you China will take the bargain, will share technology on terms that are favorable to the Global South. Now, the idea is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but triggering this process will give us the second bargaining chip that we need to go to a country like Germany, for example, and say, look, we want to give you the same bargain. If you agree to share the technology to manufacture wind turbines on our terms, manufactured and deployed in the global south. If Germany says no, okay, we'll try China. We'll try France. We'll try Spain. We'll try the US. None of them can say no at that point because we can go to China and allow China to triple its economic and geopolitical weight. Go to France, go to Spain, go to Japan and say we want high-speed rail technology manufactured and deployed on our terms in the global south. At that point, they can't withhold the sharing of technology, the transfer of technology for the building blocks of development and prosperity. The idea here again is to position the global majority at the center of a new international economic system to rewrite the rules of trade, the rules of investment, the rules of finance on terms that are favorable to the global majority, to the global south. All of this is impossible to achieve under the WTO rules, under the TRIPS agreements. And these are the red lines that today the global north refuses to accept the sharing of technology. All you get from the global north in these multilateral spaces today is false solutions, dangerous distractions that are designed to lock you in the same status quo position. And I'll close by saying that once you trigger this repositioning process, this is where we get to the climate issues, to the we're all in this together as a humanity. I'll mention just a couple of points just to trigger some of the thinking here. The strategic minerals on this planet that everybody wants, the US, China, and Europe, all three major economic blocs are obsessed with growth. And they're talking about green growth as in infinite growth, and consumerism and planned obsolescence. And if you take their visions for their own development and growth, green or not green, that means by definition, there'll be nothing left for the global south actually to develop. That is the hidden assumption. But if we use the strategic minerals for actual development in the global south on these terms, that will compel the major economic blocs to actually start thinking seriously about degrowth, about giving up consumerism, giving up planned obsolescence, and really redesigning circular economies for sustainable, higher quality of life. So that will be one of the wins on this front. The second one is for workers. And today there's this narrative in the global north in particular that what's hurting workers in Europe, what's hurting workers in the global north is immigrants who are stealing their jobs. And that's why we need to build walls. Or who's stealing their jobs? It's workers in the global south racing to the bottom, stealing their jobs. Yes. And the idea here is if our workers in the global south are busy producing high value added building blocks of development and prosperity in the south, we're no longer available to take the assembly line manufacturing that is being outsourced from the north. So that means we focus the attention on the real problem, which is technology that is displacing workers, the AI, and who's gaining from it, the automation and the robotics. And that is you focus on distribution, right? On the shareholders who are extracting wealth from workers north and south. And this way you build a united front of workers north and south, where workers in the north are now in favor of real development in the south because it enhances their social protection. And I'll leave it at that. There's much more to it, of course, than this. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Fadhel. Now I call upon Ruth to join us. Ruth?
I'm not sure it's possible to really add much after Radhika and Fadhel. I feel like saying I echo what they've said and leaving it there. So I am going to try to be short and compact, thinking with them, but also thinking with the movements that I'm part of. And I sort of want to speak about four things. The first one is a return to militant ideology and praxis. One of the things that has happened, and this is borrowing from the work of Pravin Jha, the late Samuel, and Paris Yeros. one of the things that happened with structural adjustment programs and neoliberalism, we often talk about the material impacts of it, but they talk about and extend the term around the intellectual structural adjustment that has happened in the last 40, 50 years. And that's why I'm calling for the importance of a return to a militant ideology and praxis. And I like to extend what Radhika has spoken about. When we say that capitalism has failed, then we must be very clear about what specific political and economic projects. For myself specifically, socialism still remains a project that hasn't fully had its day in the sun. Because from Thomas Sankara to Cabral to Winnie Mandela to Patrice Lumumba, the history of socialism, beyond whatever limitations that it has, rightfully so, but these are projects that saw the world in much more different ways that were unfortunately destroyed by capitalism, by imperialism, but literally the barrel of a gun. So we really need to speak about what kind of ideology is important for the present moment and going forward. Not just we are anti-capitalist, but what does it actually mean ideologically, co-constructing that liberatory ideological space. The second part around militancy is the recovery of praxis. For the last 40, 50 years, again, because of neoliberalism, a lot of resistance, and I say this very carefully because I have existed in NGO spaces, resistance, both the language and the praxis, has been reduced to NGOized projects. The NGOization of resistance, the NGOization, and the outsourcing of thinking and ideology, the difficult work that's supposed to be done in community by popular mass-based movements, has been reduced to project offices, sitting in air-conditioned offices, whether in Nairobi, in New York, in London, wherever it is. We need to recover the ideas of popular mass-based movements. That is the only way that we tackle capitalism, we tackle the oligarchs, and also the way in which we rethink ourselves as communities and as people across the world. So, for example, what can we learn in the context of that? What can we learn from, the movements of the past? Bandung, the tricontinental experience. What is our response to this particular experiments, especially within the anti-colonial movement period, but also immediate post-independence period, the period before we experience neoliberal globalization. So not mere NGO's savior work. We need to recover also class-gendered projects. Class seems to have been evacuated from the ideological work, but also the work around praxis. So that is something to actually think about. How do you think about a new class-gendered project around liberation, a return to serious materialist politics in constructive and creative ways, thinking with Cabral and Fanon when they talk about when Marxism encounters those, and this is to paraphrase, when Marxism encounters those who have been colonized, it needs to be stretched. So how can we creatively and constructively think about liberatory class-gendered projects in this particular moment? So, of course, again, feminist, queer projects, again, popular mass-based movements. And the final part for me would be thinking about what forms of solidarities, and I will not get into the models of development because Fadhel has always extensively and beautifully speaks about what is actually tangible, what is actually possible, because at the end of the day, again, as Cabral says, the people are not fighting for the ideas in your head, right? They're fighting for the right for themselves and for their children, for clean water, for food, for education. So if we are to return to these ideas around, what forms of development projects, we also have to think around power centers. And this, for me, goes back to the question around the state. And as a feminist, I always feel when I talk about the fact that we need to engage the state, because as feminists, we have serious critiques of the state, especially post-colonial states, because that we know that they have been vehicles of violence. But that's not the only thing that they've been vehicles of, right? And it is possible to reimagine the state, especially at this point, considering that the state has historically had the tools, not just for violence and coercion, but has also had the tools, right, to usher people into, the class projects around development that center the interests of the people. So I would urge us to think very carefully about the state, the power centers around that, the politics of regionalism, the kind of South-South cooperation that Fadhel has spoken about, the kind of development projects we are talking about, liberatory projects. They can't be done by one country. It cannot be Kenya alone, and then Uganda, which is our neighbor. We're like, oh, Uganda will sort itself out. There's no anti-capitalist project that is meaningful that can be done by one country. It means that we rethink ideas and rebuild ideas around regionalism. And finally, for me, it would also mean a return to, and this I borrow from the feminist comrades who've been there before us, and I see Peggy Antrobus, who is here, who has been so instrumental in feminists, especially from the global south, thinking about new worlds, new and liberatory worlds. So it means thinking about transnational, transversal forms of solidarities, labor, which is increasingly precarious and slave-like, environmental justice movements, peasant farmers, smallholder farmers who are under attack from agribusiness multinational corporations, gender and queer politics. There is no liberation without thinking critically about gender and queer politics. Let's not lie to ourselves. There's no liberation for one particular group. And finally, a recovery of the human. One of the things that, and I cannot remember who said this earlier, around the fact that the kind of violence we have witnessed, especially for those of us who are African, enslavement, colonialism, it isn't just material violence. We've also experienced cultural violence, but also spiritual violence, that we have been disconnected and deracinated from what it actually means to be human, what it means to actually have Ubuntu and the idea of Utu, that I am because you are, that the community is because the people are. So finally, for me, that would be it, to recover the ideas of a human idea of Ubuntu and Utu. So that would be, I guess, for me, the final parting shot, beyond the material, to remember to center the spiritual politics around what makes us human, what makes us stand in solidarity with Palestine, yet I am a Kenyan. What makes me stand in solidarity with, the Democratic Republic of Congo, yet I am a Kenyan woman, right? I don't have to be in Palestine. I do not have to be Palestinian in order for me to say that it cannot happen. Genocide should not happen to Palestinians or to anybody else. So above all, we need to recover the ideas of Ubuntu and Utu, and in any other beautiful, cosmologies and ideas across the world of being in communion and community with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Now I invite Guy to join us.
Thank you. Didn't want to speak before I had my audio on. I was this close. Vertebrates cannot keep up with the ongoing rate of environmental change. This finding goes back to a paper published in the peer-reviewed Ecology Letters and authored by Quintero and Weens. It was published on June 26th, 2013, so more than a dozen years ago. The paper is titled "Rates of Projected Climate Change Dramatically Exceed Past Rates of Climatic Niche Evolution Among Vertebrate Species." The paper indicates that the projected rates of environmental change would require rates of niche evolution that are 10,000 times faster than rates typically observed among species. In other words, the stunningly slow rate of change projected by reports published before 2013 still outstrips the ability of vertebrates to keep up. Mammals cannot keep up either. As reported in the prestigious peer-reviewed Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with a paper by Matt Davis and two other scholars published on October 15th, 2018. Vertebrates cannot keep up with ongoing and projected rates of environmental change. Mammals cannot keep up either. Both of these findings are based on scientifically conservative sources. As vertebrate mammals, Homo sapiens therefore falls into two broad categories labeled "can't keep up." What does the future hold? The future looks bleak for Homo sapiens and all other life on Earth. Earth has retained ice and snow floating on the Arctic Ocean for a very long time. In fact, according to a paper published in the peer-reviewed journal Science, quote, humans have only ever lived in a world topped by ice, end quote. That's the lead sentence in the final paragraph of a paper written by University of Connecticut professor Mark C. Urban. Urban is director of the Center for Biological Risk and a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. In this short paper, he writes, quote, by reflecting sunlight, Arctic ice acts as Earth's air conditioner. Once dark water replaces brilliant ice, Earth could warm substantially, equivalent to the warming triggered by the additional release of 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The ice also determines who gets rain. Loss of Arctic sea ice can make it rain in Spain, dry out Scandinavian hydropower, and set California ablaze, end quote. 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere sounds like a lot. In fact, Earth's atmosphere currently holds about 37 billion tons of carbon dioxide. An additional 1 trillion tons is equivalent to about 25 years worth of emissions at our current rate. Imagine 25 years worth of warming shortly after the Arctic ice is gone. That's huge. Harvard University professor of atmospheric science James Anderson was quoted in Forbes on January 15, 2018. Quote, the chance there will be permanent ice in the Arctic after 2022 is essentially zero, end quote. Anderson famously led the research team that discovered the link between chlorofluorocarbon emissions and the so-called hole in the ozone over Antarctica. Fortunately for us, he was mistaken about the disappearance of Arctic ice a few years ago. Professor Jennifer McKinnon of the University of California, San Diego, and also the Scripps Institution, part of the Scripps Institute, expected an ice-free Arctic Ocean in 2021. She was quoted by CBS News on April 23, 2021, upon release of a peer-reviewed paper in Nature Communications, for which she was the first author. An ice-free Arctic Ocean is clearly difficult to predict accurately. We will have very reliable information about the potential for the first ice-free Arctic Ocean during our time on Earth in early April of each year when the U.S. Navy Postgraduate School issues its 6-month ensemble forecast. We know with great certainty, for example, that we will not experience such an event this year. If we do witness an ice-free Arctic Ocean next year, then we can expect full effects the following year. That notwithstanding, I see a short and grim future for our species. How shall we act in response to this concept? For many years, I have suggested planetary hospice as a response to our seemingly short future. I will present a brief overview of this idea. I suggest viewing our lives within the context of 3 categories. 1, family and friends. 2, community. And 3, society. I recognize that this 3-category system is overly simplistic. I also recognize that these 3 categories overlap. They nonetheless offer a starting point from which we can ponder our roles in life as well as our acts. Such self-examination is worthy as well as painful. At the level of family and friends, I have suggested during various interviews and essays that we treat everyone near us as we would treat our beloved elderly grandmother. Respect and honesty are key components of such behavior. Imagine the disappointment of your grandmother as she discovers you have lied to her, and she always discovers the lie. Imagine her disappointment when you disrespect her in other ways. With potential disappointment in mind, how will you treat everyone around you? Will you respect people as you expect them to respect you? Will you approach every conversation with full honesty, or will you hide certain facts? Would you disrespect your beloved grandmother? Would you lie to her, even by omission? How do we act at the level of community poses greater challenges than our actions at the level of family and close friends. How shall we contribute to our community? If we believe it takes a community to raise a child, then does it make sense to contribute positively to our community? If so, then shall we work to terminate racism, misogyny, and other forms of injustice? Obviously, working to improve our communities falls into the category of easier said than done. We all want to benefit from living in a community that respects all its members, especially us, of course. By what steps can we take to get from a civilization characterized by rampant misogyny, racism, and monetary disparity to a community devoid of these undesirable traits? I can think of a few steps we can take. I encourage you to think of many more. If we fail, please let us fail together. We can work daily to minimize or even eliminate misogyny. We can point it out when we see it. We can develop policies in our schools, churches, and other common spaces that strive to recognize and eliminate misogyny. We can do the same with respect to racism and monetary disparity. Moving beyond policies and their implementation, we can spend time in the streets cleaning up our ugly messes. We can speak with those less fortunate than ourselves. We can listen to them. We can learn what they need. We can attempt to fulfill these needs. We can prepare food and give it to the houseless among us. We can pay for the education of those in poverty. I strongly suspect misogyny, racism, and monetary disparity have been defining elements of every civilization so far. Ridding global industrial civilization of these undesirable attributes poses a daunting challenge at which I doubt we will succeed. Taking on such a challenge in the face of seemingly impossible odds can be a measure of our character. Why take on the fight if the battle is hopeless? As a means of displaying our character. At the levels of society, there is very little any of us can do. However, I can think of one job that is worth our collective attention. There may be others. Working to cask and contain nuclear material represents one of our duties as planetary citizens. Leaving in our wake more than 450 nuclear reactors and more than 1,200 pools of so-called spent nuclear fuel has the potential to destroy all life on Earth. I can imagine no greater obligation than cleaning up the worst of our messes as we exit the planetary stage. Disgustingly, nuclear energy has been sold to us as clean energy. Thank you for your attention throughout this panel. Big thanks to my fellow panelists and especially to Dr. Rajani Kanth for bringing us together for this discussion.
Thank you, Guy. Now I'll call upon Jen to join us.
My talk is called The Maternal Species. A shift in the self-concept of the human is a necessary way out of the end of the world scenario we are experiencing now. So I propose an alternative definition of our species. We think we are the being that knows, Homo sapiens, and that knows that it knows, Homo sapiens sapiens. Instead, we don't know that we don't know, that we are actually a maternal species, Homo donans et recipiens, the species that gives and receives unilaterally in numberless ways, and that has been captured and dominated by market exchange and patriarchal capitalism. The maternal gift economy of early childhood has been replaced on the large scale and in individual lives of dominant populations with its opposite, the market economy of capitalist patriarchy. Going back to the maternal economy, we can see how human relations are created from the beginning by direct giving and receiving without quid pro quo exchange. Early childhood and capitalism and the gift economies of indigenous peoples have much in common. Discussing the indigenous gift economies of the Pacific Islands, Marcel Mauss in 1925 famously said that there were 3 steps in the gift relation: giving, receiving, and giving back. He did not see that the first 2 steps, giving and receiving, already create a human relation, and that this is typical in the mother-child interaction, because the child does not, and indeed cannot, give back an equivalent in return. This bonding and mutual recognition is also facilitated and enhanced, as we now know, by mirror neurons, which allow each to experience, if only preconsciously, the experience of the other. The original human relation is unilateral giving and receiving, not quid pro quo exchange. And it is grounded in breastfeeding, where each experiences the sensations of giving and receiving of the self and the other, confirming the existence of the other for each. But interpersonal mutual knowledge is experienced also in face-to-face interaction, holding and cuddling, etc. Giving to satisfy the need of the other gives value to the other. That is, it attributes an intrinsic value to her or him. It is done with the gifts of many different kinds of things at many levels. Food, perception, like pointing, services, carrying and bathing, giving the baby to someone else to hold, taking her somewhere, and so on. If we realize that we are homo donans and recipients, a mothering and a mothered species, we can more easily look for evidence that confirms it, and we can adjust our behavior to accord with this life-positive shared self-concept. At present, we have adhered to the idea of homo homini lupus, with an apology to the wolves, because the economy of capitalism places us in conflict and competition for survival with all those around us. And we need to use our sapiens knowledge and know-how in order to compete to survive economically. Quid pro quo exchange is foregrounded in practice in our society, and it overshadows and displaces giving and receiving into a background that seems to belong to a non-economic, perhaps a moral category. I have written about giving and receiving with its derivations and variations as an unseen basic template of our human relations and meaningful actions, which instead are understood abstractly or as genetically determined, like language, for example, without referring to what I believe is an obvious possible origin, necessarily universal maternal practice without which the baby dies. In fact, Noam Chomsky talked about the poverty of the stimulus regarding a model for language. Instead, I propose the ubiquity of the stimulus, the maternal giving and receiving practice as the model for language. In my book, The Gift in the Heart of Language, the maternal source of meaning. I believe we are all homo donans and recipients because we learn this interaction in our infancy, and the underlying template continues throughout our lives, though our attention is focused on its contradiction, quid pro quo, equal exchange, which we begin to understand around age 3. Unilateral giving and receiving, which is necessarily the model in the first 3 years and beyond, is ignored, sanctified, discounted, or exploited. In fact, capitalism can be seen as a system in which the many are forced to give unilaterally to the few through surplus labor, women's free labor in the home, and the plunder of the gifts of nature. The market, based on the logic of quid pro quo, invades and displaces the gift-based economy of childhood and creates egocentric adults adapted to making the market economy function for them. Capitalists find ways of nurturing their capital and making it grow like an abstract rematerialized child, adding to it the gifts of profit they make, then investing it again in order to add more gifts, growing their capital. In fact, the hypothesis of the fundamental and continuing, though hidden and exploited, maternal human economy sheds a new light on who we are, what the economy is, and what we must do to continue to nurture life rather than nurturing gendered, racial, political, and economic domination, abstraction, and death. The market has been analyzed abstractly. The relations of childhood have been analyzed abstractly also, but we have not seen the continuity between the two, between the market sphere and the externality, the domestic sphere. The one is actually parasitic on the other and distorts it, hiding it, making the knowledge of its free gifts inaccessible to the patriarchal, capitalist, economic gaze, while naming the gifts instinctual nurturing behavior, or work that is worth less because performed by a woman outside the market. The coexistence of the two economies and the dominance of exchange over gifting creates a blind spot or blind layer so that free gifts of care, free housework, free or low-cost appropriation of nature remain unseen or unrecognized as such. In fact, in capitalism, the maternal gift economy subsidizes the market sphere by giving unilateral gifts and resources to it, including the next generation of workers, who in turn, through the market, give their unilateral gifts of surplus labor value to capitalists, who give it to their capital. Now it is up to our species as Homo donans et recipiens to recognize ourselves, to know ourselves in a new way, to justify our other orientation and gifting goodwill, to shift the paradigm away from ego-oriented capitalism and patriarchy, and change our behavior by reframing our self-concept in terms of the maternal model for all, a model that still exists. Indeed, it permeates our societies as the basic cognitive, linguistic, and relational structure, though it has been hidden and exploited. This is the structure of the maternal species, of maternal humanity, composed of children and men and women and men and children, that together with Mother Earth can and will provide abundantly and in peace for all if we recognize it and give it and ourselves a chance.
Thank you, Genevieve. And now we'll round off with Michel.
Yes. Hello. So I think I want to spend my 10 minutes in explaining the option that I propose and monitor, which is now basically called cosmolocalism. And so let me explain first what it is. It is a very simple adage: what is heavy is local, and what is light is global and shared. It's abstract, so let me start with an example. Some people I'm somehow related to and sorry if I mispronounce the name of the region. It's the Kilifi or Kilifi region in Kenya, and it's the Sarafu project. So this was started with about 1,000 women's savings groups called ROTAs, Rotational Savings and Loans Associations, where a group of women gave like 5-10 euros, probably less. And so every week or every month, somebody of the circle gets the whole amount, and that allows them to buy things that they can't afford, like maybe a motorcycle or a phone or something of that nature. So this is something that is widely existent in Africa, also in Thailand. I live here for 20 years, and my daughter bought a motorcycle with one of the 3 rotas that my wife is a member of. So this is something very common. But what they did is they joined themselves, created a common pool, and on top of that created a mutual credit system. So basically creating their own currency within their networks. And because there is a common collateral, they trust it. And so they can, these were very poor people in the Mombasa slums, and then it moved to the coastal regions of Kenya. So on top of that, they added basically a blockchain for transparency, which means that everything becomes visible, and that now allows people to basically support them and to see the effect, the immediate effect that it has on the well-being of these communities. Then they added, and this is a difficult word, but I'll say it anyway, cyber physicalization of ancestral sharing practices. This is very important. So they basically talk to the elders about Ubuntu-based practices and other local, I think it's called Meria or something. And they basically created a commitment pooling system that scales the very local sharing practices to the whole community. And here's the interesting thing, it can scale globally. So for example, last week, there were people from Malaysia doing eco-certification, and they now have a shared system of value exchange with these communities in Kenya. So basically, cosmolocalism is the idea that we need to localize. And why do we need to localize? Because transportation today costs us 3 times more than production. So we spend 3 times more matter energy to transport than to produce. So the simple fact of localization is already a huge factor in decreasing the human weight on nature. Second effect, of course, is mutualization. Mutualization is a superpower. I'll tell you an example from my own country, my old country in Belgium. So in Ghent, we have a car sharing agreement, which is not Uber, of course. It's an association and a cooperative. There's different ones. And every shared car replaces 9 to 13 individual cars. Why would you do that? Because public transport doesn't solve everything, and you can still do point-to-point, and everybody has access to mobility, but at a hugely lower cost. So there's a project called Factor 20 reduction, using these techniques to reduce energy and matter usage by a factor of 20. And if you're interested, there are plenty of examples doing that. Let me give you another example from India, the solar lamp project. So basically, it's an open design, so anybody can make it, which is effectively what happens. So local Indian small factories, cooperative factories, make these solar lamps. That has allowed 4 million kids in Indian villages to have light at night, and so join basically the schooling system on their own, which wasn't possible before. And then there is an open source core system in agreement with what is called IIT Bombay. And I think another 40,000 students have actually been able to join the university system from these 4 million village kids. So again, what is cosmolocal? The activity, the production is local, but the knowledge is shared amongst all the people who join the project in the whole world. So there are some political consequences to it, right? The first one is that you don't have to rely on the state. So for example, you're familiar with Airbnb. There is also something called Fairbnb, which is a fairer version of apartment sharing, only one person, so no hotels. It's real. It's a real peer-to-peer apartment sharing, which some people need, just to earn a bit more in their month. And of course, it needs a collective infrastructure, and you don't need the support of the state. You can create a coalition of cities globally who collectively support the open source infrastructure of that project. So does that have any influence on the state, on the nation state? So I would argue essentially it's already a post-national kind of idea, where it relies on bioregionalism and cosmolocalism together. So let me just briefly explain that. So bioregionalism are all the efforts within a territory to regenerate the soil and other ecological factors in a particular territory. So people doing different things, working together. And we now already have something called a bioregional financing facility, which exists to support these kinds of projects. Then we have the vertical line, which is the cosmolocal line, which is all the people doing the same thing, organized cosmically and learning from each other. And studies show that the collective learning is like 8 times faster than it was like 5 or 10 years ago. So so it's also a question of social power, of course, because we can create these global interconnected collaborations. And so the role of the state can be what I call the partner state. And maybe it sounds utopian, but there is actually certainly at a local level a self-interest for local administrators and politicians to support these kinds of relocalized production projects. Just to give an example, eco-villages, there were 120 10 years ago in France, and now 1,200. Why? Because there's a lot of empty villages, and these mayors are leasing for 99 years almost for free land, which otherwise on the market is just impossible to obtain. And so it has given the freedom for many more people who have this desire, to go back to the rural and produce their own food, to actually do it. So cosmolocalism is I think something very interesting, and I'll just finish maybe with a historical view about the historical importance of the commons. So in tribal kinship-based societies, the commons are like the natural, just what they do, this kind of collective communal way of organizing and producing. Once we enter civilization, quote unquote, we have basically states and then markets. But here's the thing, even empires respect the commons, right? So if you have medieval Europe or imperial China, the farmers have their commons. They have their own little plot of land. They have the land of the Lord, which they have to work on. But they also have communal land, which is like the social security system, and it's respected.
1 minute.
Okay, so very quickly, capitalism abolishes the commons, the first system that actually abolishes and tries to destroy the commons. So the history is first we have physical commons, then we abolish physical commons and privatize them. The working class, which is basically the farmers which escape the land, creates social commons as a response to capitalism, which ultimately becomes this welfare state. So it's a statification of the social commons. We create the digital commons in 1990s. And I think this gives us a new chance to share knowledge at scale and to create social power at scale. But a social power that is not limited to national politics, but that can actually be projected at a global scale. And if you're interested, wiki.p2pfoundation.net, we have 40,000 case studies, and we also have a book, The Cosmolocal Reader, with 40 case studies. So I'm just saying this is something real. It's not just my imagination. There is today an exodus of some people, maybe 2-3% of the population in Europe, with a tenfold increase in 10 years of people choosing this cosmolocal route. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. Well, the last 10 minutes is set aside for discussion, so I thought I might put an idea before you. As somebody who has studied history, capital insertion, the whole bit, and for the last 500 years thoroughly, it's always seemed unusual, or maybe not, that's the wrong word. There are commonalities, obviously, to anybody who observes between capitalism and socialism. The one thing that they share is the notion of growth. Economic growth is good. I mean, if you take China and the United States as proxies for socialism, and it's not really, but let's say it is, notice that's the one thing they agree upon. Both would like to grow, and growth is part of the... Now, what if growth itself is the problem? I mean, I thought growth was the ideology of the cancer cell, but both these systems seem to, and to what extent does growth itself create the problem that we have been trying to discuss here? So let me just put that out, and anybody can speak and address it if you think it's important. Yes, go ahead, Michel. Michel?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes. Yeah, I actually, and I would like to share that idea that I think a lot of the alternatives today from the global south still presume growth, and that is, if you listen to Guy, we have some contradiction there, right? So basically, I do believe we are to a certain degree a Promethean species. So I think it will be very hard to put us back in this kind of indigenous frame. But I think mutualization, I want to stress that mutualization is a very important part because we can grow resilience, right? So if we have this growth pattern in us, it doesn't necessarily have to express itself in material competition, which is, I think, where we went in our materialist, what you call EM society. But think about medieval Christianity or Buddhist Southeast Asia, 1,000 years ago. A lot of people were growing internally, right? The aim of life was to meditate, to know yourself better, to eventually get enlightened, or in medieval Christianity would be, you know, salvation or whatever, right? So I think we can basically, you know, subsume or sublimate our Promethean urge, and I think, you know, I'm glad that you asked that question, because I think it's absolutely essential. Like this is our spiritual problem. Like, you know, as long as we want to grow, we're not going to get anywhere. But I mean, grow the way we used to grow, right? So, but that doesn't mean we have to be a static species. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Correct. Any other opinions on this? Go ahead, Radhika.
Yeah, I just want to say two things. I mean, first of all, you can have, I mean, okay. I think we agreed that over the last 45 odd years since the onset of neoliberalism, the rate at which we have been destroying the environment has radically gone up. But these have been precisely the decades of slower growth. So in what way is growth per se connected with environmental destruction? I think that it's the kind of growth we're talking about, and there are various kinds of growth that we can have without necessarily destroying the environment. So that's the first thing I want to say. And I think that that if we have growth whose gains are more equally distributed within and between societies, that is a surer way of ensuring planetary survival than to tell poor societies that are poor today that they should resort to, you know, some kind of spiritual growth and be satisfied with their material condition as it is today. First of all, this material condition is nowhere near a natural material condition. It is a material condition created by imperialism, which has taken from these societies and given to the richer societies. And I think the dismantling of the structures of imperialism will go a long way towards doing that. Also, I'm not a historian, but if my understanding of these older societies is at all accurate, while of course some people may have chosen to seek spiritual growth, the condition of the overwhelming majority of these people was not so great. And I think that, you know, to say that they don't need development, and particularly to say that the third world today doesn't need development of a better sort, obviously. I'm not, for example, not everybody in the third world needs cars if we create good, environmentally sustainable public transportation systems. We don't need private cars. Today's poor countries can have a vastly superior type of modernization than was experienced in first world countries. But simply to say that we don't need growth, the growth is the problem, I don't think it's going to get us anywhere, quite frankly.
Now, the Club of Rome raised this a long time ago, 1960s, I believe. And I think it's time to raise it again. Are there no limits to growth? Or should there be limits to growth? What do you think, Guy?
There are limits to growth, without question. In fact, there have been at least 2 follow-up papers, the latter in peer-reviewed literature, indicating that we are beyond the limits to growth, that we have already surpassed the point at which we can support more than 8 billion people on this finite planet. So we're in real trouble, folks. And continuing to promote growth for the sake of growth, the ideology of a cancer cell, according to Edward Abbey, is the wrong approach. I don't know what the right approach is, but I'm certain that it is not either promoting the idea of economic growth or completely shutting down civilization or this society or whatever. There are too many people who depend on this set of living arrangements to just have it go away. That would be the most unethical thing I could possibly imagine. But I don't know the answers here. I've been pleading for answers for nearly a decade, and we're in a difficult spot.
So can we not have a just distribution, perhaps, without growth? Can we not have justice? Can we not have all the good things that we all want without necessarily requiring growth to be the causal agent here. What do you say, Fadhel? You had your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just emphasize a point that Radhika was alluding to, which is the quality. I mean, the metric that we're talking about is GDP, which is a very misleading metric. I mean, $100 million spent to clean an oil spill is growth, technically speaking. But $100 million of preventative care is also measured as growth. Qualitatively, obviously, these are not the same things. We want the preventative care $100 million worth of spending. We don't want the oil spill to happen in the first place, and we don't want the growth that cleans up the oil spill, right? So this is very important in terms of changing the metric. When it comes to the discussion that the Club of Rome and the New International Economic Order discussion, we're talking about the movement of literally 50 some years ago, right? There was a report that was presented at the UN General Assembly exactly 50 years ago called What Now? Another Development, in which close to 100 experts, mostly from the Global South, but also from the Global North, economists and others, who presented a coherent, comprehensive, long-term vision of finishing the unfinished business of colonialism, right? Of decolonizing economic structure. And that's why they called it another development. They didn't want to use the term development, which is a hijacked term by the Global North at the time. So we're talking about another development in which at the time they didn't have the phrase or the term degrowth, but they describe qualitatively what a world of degrowth would be. What is the kind of quality of life that we can achieve in a country like Sweden versus a developing country that just came out of the colonial period? So all of that literature and all of that effort was silenced and killed in the last 50 years via the neoliberal takeover. And what we're trying to do with this discussion, with a lot of other discussions across the Global South in the last few years, is trying to revive and update and improve and use the geopolitical context that we live in today to redefine what development actually means in the context that Radhika was alluding to, another kind of development. What is the metric and what is the quality of life that will allow us to thrive as human beings and to enjoy a much higher quality of life, but also to live within the planetary boundaries, and that the Club of Rome 50 years ago, and the Club of Rome is still doing this work. Remember The Economist, when the Club of Rome came out with that report, the mainstream of the economics profession laughed and ridiculed the Club of Rome, right? And it's the economics profession that is to blame for the destruction of all of the efforts that were beginning to show some, to gain some traction. The economics profession killed it, and the economics profession is responsible for that.
True. Genevieve, any comments on the growth issue? Any comments on the issue of growth?
I think we've grown much too much, and especially in the North, and we need to look at real needs and satisfy those as much as we can. And probably the degrowth movement is a good idea.
Ruth, are you still here? I think you may have turned your video off, but if you're here, yeah, what about growth? What's your feeling about the necessity of continuous growth yeah.
Muted. Okay. I mean, I must be very honest that I struggle, maybe I struggle with the term, the question itself around growth. And that's why perhaps I was insisting on thinking through what a liberatory development project may look like. And of course, development with its critiques in the context of how it's conceptualized in the context of language. But I mean development, for example, for me as an African, when I think about the immediate post-independence projects, which are mostly socialist projects across the continent of Africa. But I want to speak about the question in a particular way. I think it is a bit disingenuous to simply pit socialism and even Marxism, let me go further than that, with capitalism, considering that we haven't yet had a proper socialist project. Because every real socialist project that has been attempted, and let me not even talk about, let me just speak about the Global South, that every attempt at a proper socialist project that views development not as endless growth or as a means to enrich and build an elite class hasn't succeeded, not on its own terms where it has been allowed to fail, but because the leadership of countries, people were forced into neoliberal projects, people were literally shot dead. I do think that being very clear about why particular projects have not succeeded is important, rather than simply put capitalism has been allowed to. The reason it exists is because it has had the right conditions and has been allowed to actually flourish. I mean, flourish at the expense of the wretched of the earth, again, going back to Fanon. But I do think that we need to be very, very clear about, what ideology, that's what I was talking about, the importance of going back to not just projects as in projects devoid of ideology, devoid of politics, but we have to speak about these things within one historical context that they emerge from, within, and Fadhel speaks very clearly about the political, economic moment we are in the world. So I think it's important to do that. We just can't pit socialism and Marxism and say that both of them are interested in just growth. I think reading through history, being very, very clear about what this idea, because they're ideological projects above all, beyond being material projects, they are ideological projects.
Right. Let me then, as we move towards concluding this, make a comment here. I'm reminded of what Gandhi said about growth that might be interesting. The leadership of India went to him around independence, whenever it was, I forget actually exactly when, and asked about the future for India, which way shall we go? And here's what he said, and it may not be verbatim, but more or less. He said, and this would be for growth enthusiasts, tiny little England used up the resources of the entire world to develop. How many planets, he said, will India need? That was his answer. So I think it bears thinking before we, there are limits to everything. Growth was not the philosophy of the world before the modernist revolutions took place. You can call it capital, call it anything you want. So it's not as if we are programmed to want growth. It's because it was foisted upon us by everything that I spoke about. So I don't want to repeat all that. But anyway, I think it's been a fantastic panel. I've learned so much really listening to all of you. But let me also say this, that I think in general, there's a sense in this panel that we have failed to achieve the objectives that each one of us values in terms of where the world is at today. I think that there's sufficient agreement there. But then let me close this in the words of Samuel Beckett. Here's what he said. He said, I try and I fail. Then I try again and I fail better. So let's all try and fail better this time around, next time around. Thank you all very, very much. I'm grateful to all of you. I'm sorry if I offended you, Radhika. It's totally unintentional. Anyway, I wish you all good things, and maybe it'll be a better world. Thank you all. And don't forget to thank Diane and Lisa, who've been behind the scenes. Maybe they can show themselves. Diane and Lisa, show yourself. Yeah. Thank you all for everything. It's a fantastic work, at the back. So have a great summer, and let's hope we survive 2025. Thank you. Bye-bye.